Hi, so today is May the 1st, Workers' Day, and welcome to this special recorded edition of the Week 8 lecture for AZA1325. Today we're going to be looking at a country that had a really extraordinary and fascinating history during the 20th century, and that is, of course, the country of Japan. But before we move on and talk about that, let me just run through some of the important administrative things that are important to know about this stage of the unit. So, first of all, a quick reminder that the second Moodle quiz will be open from today. I'm going to open it once I've uploaded this lecture. And I've decided to extend the end deadline for the quiz for another 2 days, basically to take into account time lost during the public holiday. So, whereas previously the test was scheduled to close at midnight on Friday, I'm going to extend it to close on Sunday, May the 5th, midnight instead. The topics for the Moodle quiz will be everything we've covered from weeks 5 to 8. So, as a reminder, that includes everything we did with Africa, the Vietnam War, China, as well as today's lecture on Japan. Second thing is that the Week 8 online tutorial is currently open and going, so please remember to participate in that instead of attending class tutorials. And then please remember that there'll be a guest lecture on Friday, right between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We're going to have a lecture on basically diplomatic and foreign policy challenges for the next South African government. So the guest lecturer will be a former South African diplomat from Turco, who's going to be talking about a very topical issue. The major foreign policy problems that South Africa will have to deal with after the formation of our new government next week. And then speaking of which, next week we will also not be having a lecture due to election day. So please you won't be coming to class, but please do go to the polls and vote. It's important for, communicating policy preferences to the government. It helps to make the democratic system work. And then please also note that the feedback and marks for the annotated bibliography assignment are now out. So you can check those by going to Turnitin or Pass. The literature review is the literature review essay, which builds off the annotated bibliography, is due on Monday the 13th of May. And I've attached some voice comments to every annotated bibliography, just with some thoughts on each bibliography, what I see as being the strengths and weaknesses, and things that could be improved or strengthened before the literature review essay is due. So please do try to implement those suggestions. It should be a good way to improve your marks for the essay. Okay, so with all of that being said, let's take a look at the really fascinating history of the country that we're going to be looking at today, which is Japan. So, ever since the 1600s, when Japan was first unified under the rulership of the Tokugawa government, Japan for the next 300 years was isolated from the rest of the world. So between the 1600s and the 1800s, Japan was a unified and centralized state, but one that had very little communication with the outside world and had very little trade with the outside world. And as a result, during a period of really rapid technological advancement globally, Japan fell behind compared to the imperial powers of the West, and the result of this was that by the mid 1800s, Japan had essentially become a backwards nation, right? It had its technology and level of development was still what we would associate today with a medieval type of state in terms of its technology, its military. It was an agricultural economy. Its military was still based on traditional weapons like swords and spears and old-fashioned types of guns. And it would have been outmatched by any of the Western imperial powers at the time. In 1954, a squadron of American warships showed up in Tokyo Harbor and basically said, you need to open your borders, end your period of isolation, and engage in trade and contact with the rest of the world. And it's fascinating to think how shocking this must have been at the time for the society that had been incredibly isolated. I think the only analogy that we can sort of think of today in terms of what it would be like would be, imagine that like alien spaceships or something like that showed up one day, with this fantastically advanced weaponry that we don't have. Think of what a shock to the system it would be for all the people in the world. This is kind of like what it was for Japan in 1854. The state that was basically at a sort of a feudal level of economic development, suddenly encountered the American military with its steam-powered warships and cannons and sophisticated firearms. It was a complete shock, right? It was similar in a way to the sort of shock that was experienced by China at the time. In some ways, China was in a similar position under the Qing dynasty. It was a sort of an old-fashioned, traditional state that had isolated itself from the rest of the world, and thus had fallen behind in terms of its technology and its military power. And when China basically encountered the Western colonial powers, it caused so much disruption and such a shock to the Chinese political system that China imploded into civil war, and basically did not re-emerge as a centralized state until the victory of the Communist Party in the late 1940s. But in Japan, a very different path was followed. So Japan initially was destabilized, but after a brief civil war, in 1968, a new government came into power, and this became known as the Meiji era, right? The new period in Japanese history was known as the Meiji Restoration, and essentially what happened was that the old feudal style of government was destroyed and replaced by a new reformist government that was determined to modernize and reform the country. And so during the late, in the space of a couple of decades, between 1868 and 1905, what we had was this extremely rapid modernization of every aspect of Japanese society and life, right? The Japanese government, the system of laws, the culture, the economy, everything was, the military, right? Everything was updated. The economy was overnight transformed, was industrialized. The Japanese military was updated with, at the time with the most modern types of weapons. And it's difficult to imagine what it must have been like, to have been an ordinary Japanese person at the time, to essentially experience, what in the rest of the world would have been, 3 or 4 centuries of technological development. In Japan took place over the course of only about 20 or 30 years, right? But the results of this were made apparent in 1905 when Japan became embroiled in a war against one of the great European powers of the day, which was the Russian Empire. And when this war began, almost everyone in Europe just kind of naturally assumed that Russia would easily defeat Japan, because this period, there had basically been 100 years in which the European imperial and colonial powers had become the dominant states in the world. It had been more than a century since any European army or navy had been defeated by a non-European country. And so most Europeans just thought that, well, obviously Japan will lose and Russia will win. But in fact, Japan, thanks to its modernization of its military, managed to surprise and really shock the rest of the world by inflicting a really crippling defeat against the Russian Empire, which was considered prior to that to be one of the most powerful countries in the world. But the Japanese fleet basically managed to successfully trap and then essentially annihilate the Russian Pacific Fleet, and forced Russia to sign a humiliating peace treaty. And so what happens is really two things, right? Firstly, that Japan has now really followed a unique historical arc. Right? That first of all, during the age of Western imperialism and colonialism, Japan has managed to avoid becoming being colonized itself. And eventually what's going to happen is that Japan is going to use its newfound military power to become an imperial power itself, which is something completely unique. In the age of Western imperialism, there's only one non-European country that itself becomes an imperial power, and that is Japan. So let's take a quick look at the geography of Japan, and you can see here that, of course, Japan is an island country. It's located at the far eastern extremity of the Asian continent. It consists of islands, 4 major islands, but a huge number of smaller ones as well. And then you can see here on the map on the other side of the screen, a map of the furthest extent of the Japanese Empire in World War II. And so Japan ultimately is going to create its own colonial empire. And as you can see, that colonial empire is very large, right? It ends up controlling a significant amount. It becomes the dominant power in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and ends up controlling huge swathes of the Pacific Ocean. So, to give you a sense of how rare and unusual that was, you can see here this map that basically shows the full extent of European colonialism during the 19th century. And essentially the only countries that were never colonized are the ones in orange, which on this map is basically only 4 countries: Liberia, Thailand, Korea, and Japan. I kind of feel like Ethiopia should be on the map as well, but the point is that it's a very small number of countries around the world that actually managed to avoid Western colonialism. And of those other ones, none of them became colonial powers in their own right. So Japan's history is incredibly unique and unusual within the world. Now, from the Japanese perspective, there was no moral reason why they should not create their own colonial empire. From their perspective, Britain and France and other European countries had done the same thing, and this was just a thing that powerful countries did back then, and other powerful nations had their own colonies. Why should Japan not do the same? Nevertheless, it's also important to appreciate the brutality and the violence that were committed during the period of Japanese colonial expansion, especially in terms of Japanese expansion into China. There were just truly horrific mass killings and abuses of human rights that were committed, extremely violent and horrific acts that were committed. In 1937, Japan invaded the northern part of China and began conquering along the Chinese coastline, and other Western countries from Japan felt this was somewhat hypocritical, but Western countries were very critical of Japan's colonial campaign in China. And the United States in particular basically presented Japan with an ultimatum and said that it had to give up its colonial conquests, or America would punish Japan for its invasion of China by embargoing Japanese, or basically by refusing to sell oil to Japan. Now, Japan had no domestic sources of oil itself, at the time during this period in history, oil was a vital resource for military forces, right? You needed diesel to run tanks. Oil was required to power battleships. An army could not function without a supply of oil. So when the US threatened to cut off Japan's supply of oil, this was seen by Japan as a direct military challenge, right? Not just a form of economic punishment, but this was an attack against the military power of Japan. And so Japan had really only two options that were available to it. Its first option was that it could give in and withdraw from China, but the Japanese government felt that if they did this, then Japan would always be a kind of a second-rate world power from then on. Their other option would be to try to conquer their own source of oil and bring in some oil-producing region of the world within their own empire. And this was the Dutch East Indies, what is today the islands of Indonesia. Japanese military planners felt that if they conquered these territories from the Dutch, then they would have their own source of oil, and then they would be able to fuel their own military. But they also knew that if they did this, they would basically be inviting war against the Americans and perhaps the British as well. So what the Japanese did was they decided to invade the Dutch East Indies, and then in order to prevent a counterattack from the United States and the British, they launched preemptive military strikes against the major British and American military bases in the Pacific. So they attacked the British port of Singapore, which was a major base for the British Navy, and they also simultaneously launched an attack against the main American naval base in the Pacific, which was the huge naval base at Pearl Harbor. And from the Japanese point of view, this was a preemptive strike. They knew that there was going to be war against these countries anyway, and so they decided to take the risk of attacking first. But of course, this was a very fateful decision, because in doing so, this brought Japan into the Second World War and brought it into direct war against the United States. And of course, this was a war that Japan was ultimately destined to lose. So I'm not going to talk too much about Japan's performance in World War II itself, but suffice to say that Japan lost the war. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese admiral who led that attack actually said that probably what would happen is that after attacking the Americans, the Japanese would do well in the war for 6 months, and then the Americans would go on the offensive and would ultimately defeat Japan. And this proved to be a really prophetic. This proved to be a really accurate prediction, because this was almost exactly what happened. Exactly 6 months after the attack at Pearl Harbor, the American carrier fleet encountered the Japanese carrier fleet at the Battle of Midway, and the Americans destroyed almost the entirety of the Japanese carriers. And from then on, the end of the war was essentially inevitable. And what followed from the Battle of Midway onwards was this really slow, grinding, very, very unpleasant war in which the Americans slowly advanced from one island to another, and the Japanese slowly fell back from one island to another, kind of fighting fiercely at every stage. By 1944, the Japanese had fallen back to the point where the Japanese home islands themselves were within range of the American military forces. The U.S. Navy blockaded Japan. The Japanese islands were bombed. Cities across Japan were destroyed with incendiary weapons. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens were ultimately killed. And really the culmination of the war was the destruction of two of Japan's cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, through the use of a new type of weapon, which was the atomic bomb. And so on September the 2nd, Japan surrendered unconditionally, and Japan became Japan essentially lost its political independence and became an occupied nation under the rule of the American general who commanded the American forces in the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur. So I just want to quickly show you some scenes from this last period that you can see. This is a photograph taken showing the sort of level of the volume, the tonnage of bombs that were dropped on Japanese cities. This is a shot of the city of Tokyo, which was at the time mostly built of wooden, like wooden and paper buildings, and was attacked with fire bombs, incendiary weapons, and vast areas of the city were just destroyed completely. And this is the city of Hiroshima in the aftermath of the atomic bomb. And you can see how badly it was, so much of the city was essentially just reduced to rubble. So Japan, when it came out of World War II, was in a really bad state. But at this point, Japan's history changes completely, because the previous Japanese authoritarian government, which had started the war in the first place, was essentially swept away. And there was from now on a 7-year period of direct rule by the United States from 1945 to 1952. And this is the period in which the modern Japanese state is actually created. And even to this day, many aspects of the Japanese government and political system really have their origin point in this period of American occupation. And in some ways you could draw an analogy here with another country that was occupied at the end of World War II, which is Germany. But there's an important difference here, right? Which is that in the case of Germany, Germany was occupied by all of the different Allied countries at the same time, including the Western Allies, but also the Russians. And so, what we had in the case of Germany was this case of split development, where Germany became divided in two, and we had a West German state that developed along capitalist lines, and an East German state that developed into a communist country. In the case of Japan, however, all of Japan was occupied and controlled by the Americans, without having to share power with anyone else, and definitely not with the Soviet Union. And so what we have in the case of Japan is that America really has a free hand to put its own stamp on the type of state that Japan is going to be in the future. Now, within this occupation phase, we can kind of divide it into two broad phases. For the first 2 years, there is what is called the liberal phase of the occupation that attempts to transform Japan from what it had been previously, which was a very militaristic, aggressive, imperialistic country. During the liberal phase, America tries to disarm Japan and to convert it into a sort of a peaceful, pacifist, liberal country, establishing democracy and pacifism in the Constitution. But fairly soon, the Americans partially reverse course, and this reverse course phase starts to focus on the Japanese economy and national security, and partially reverses some of the liberal ideals that were put into place earlier. So let's look at these two phases one by one. So the goal of the liberal phase was, from the American side of things, to transform Japan into a liberal, democratic, and peaceful society that would no longer be a military threat. But in the process, America put in place many progressive reforms, including things like land reform, giving farmland to peasant farmers, rights for workers, trade unions, creating new rights for women, giving women the right to vote, things that had never been the case in Japan before. The high point of this was the creation of a new Japanese constitution, which was essentially written for the Japanese without too much consultation by the American occupying authorities, and this new Japanese constitution created guarantees for human rights. It included rights for women. It downgraded the role of the emperor in the Japanese political system. The Japanese emperor still existed, but Japan was changed into a constitutional monarchy. So think of a country like the UK today. We still have like the Queen of England still plays some role in the British state, but it's very much a symbolic role. She doesn't have any political power. Very much the same thing was done in Japan, where the emperor was still the symbolic head of the state, but was essentially removed from a position of power in the political system. And then on top of that, a really unusual and actually unique clause was put into the Constitution, which was Article 9. And this is the so-called peace clause of the Japanese Constitution. And the peace clause essentially said that Japan is as a matter of fundamental law, right, within the Japanese Constitution, the highest law of the land, Japan is not permitted to go to war against other countries. And in fact, not only that, but Japan was also theoretically prevented from having a military. And this is a commitment that no other country is willing to make, right? No other country on earth is willing to enshrine it into law that it is not allowed to use its military or go to war. Definitely not put it in its constitution, right? This is really a unique byproduct of the fact that Japan's constitution was written for it by a occupying power. But as we'll see, America at some point starts to rethink whether this was actually a good idea. But by then it's too late, and the peace clause has really become entrenched. Nevertheless, as soon as 1948, the US started to wonder whether it was actually a good thing to focus so heavily on demilitarizing Japan. And within a few years, we start to have signs that the US is actually reversing course and no longer wants Japan to be completely disarmed, but it actually wants to rebuild Japan into a stronger ally in the context of the Cold War. The problem here was that within only a few years of the end of World War II, the US had become engaged in a struggle against Russia that we now know today as the Cold War. The US was very concerned about the rise of communism in Asia. It wanted to oppose the growth of Russian power, and the US was now also concerned about, increasingly concerned about communist China. And so within a very short space of time, we start to have America's whole way of thinking about changes. America stops thinking of Japan as a potential threat which needs to be disarmed, and the Americans instead begin to think of Japan as an obvious potential ally in the Cold War. And so power in Japan starts to shift back to the political establishment that ran the country even before World War II, and Japan starts to become a much more conservative and bureaucratic state, and we have a sort of a return to power of the Japanese political elite with the aid and the assistance of the United States. In 1952, the US signs a peace treaty with Japan, and Japan essentially regains its independence and its sovereignty. Right, prior to this, Japan has been an occupied nation, so it is essentially prior to between 1945 and 1952, Japan has not had its own government, but in 1952, Japan signs a peace treaty, and political power is restored to the Japanese government. The Japanese government regains its independence from the United States, but as part of the treaty that was signed, Japan agrees to host American military forces on a semi-permanent basis. Most of these troops are based in Okinawa, which is a large island quite a bit to the south of Japan. If you look at the map that I show you, you can see that Okinawa is almost halfway between China and Japan, and it's also within striking distance of North Korea, Taiwan, as well as of the Chinese mainland. So Okinawa has a very strategic location. And this is a great military base for the Americans. And the Americans end up stationing a very large force of troops, 260,000 troops, an enormous army, in Japan and especially in Okinawa. And as America goes to war in Korea, Japan essentially becomes the American staging and logistical ground that it uses to support its armies there. In 1954, Japan creates its own military, which is called the Self-Defense Force, and because of Article 9, the Peace Clause, in theory, Japan's military is a branch of its police force rather than an independent service on its own right. But Japan chooses not to spend very much money on rebuilding its military strength. And what happens at this point is that Japan has basically reconciled itself to the idea that U.S. military forces are going to be in Japan pretty much forever. And the Japanese government is actually okay with that because it allows Japan to avoid having to spend its own money on its own military and focus its resources on its economy. And this idea becomes known as the Yoshida Doctrine, named after Japan's first Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida. This was his grand strategy in the world. That he felt that the most important goal for Japan was to rebuild its economy after the devastation of the Second World War. And so he felt that the best way to do that would be to take money that you would ordinarily spend on the military and to invest those resources on economic development rather than military spending. Now, of course, he could do this because America was there, right? So there was no need to spend money on the Japanese military. Japan could just essentially outsource its security to the United States. Now, Yoshida himself was actually a Japanese nationalist. His long-term goal was to rebuild the Japanese military. He felt, though, that in the short term it would be better to focus on economic development and then only switch around to rebuilding the military later on. But by that point, the system of America pays for Japan's defense had become quite entrenched. And some Americans were somewhat resentful of this and felt that Japan was essentially free riding on U.S. security. In other words, taking advantage of the fact that it didn't have to spend money on its own defense. It could just leave the U.S. to do that for it. But the U.S. at least initially was happy to do that because of the fact that Japan was seen as an important ally in the Cold War. So we start to have this new situation where Japan officially regains its independence, but its military security is provided by the United States, and Japan's foreign policy becomes very, very closely aligned with the United States when the U.S. makes major moves and changes in its foreign policy. Like, for example, in 1949, the U.S. recognized Taiwan as the rightful government of China. Japan did the same, right? So Japan is essentially willing to follow America's lead in terms of its foreign policy. So what's going on at this point in Japanese politics? Well, it takes a little while for the Japanese political system to become developed. But the system that eventually evolves is known as the 1955 system. And this is the emergence of political domination by the main Japanese party, which is the Liberal Democratic Party. So the cause of this, initially after Japan became independent and the occupation ended, initially there were a large number of political parties in Japan all vying for control, and there was a lot of there were many different factions, but what happens is that over time the political system starts to become crystallized, and we have the emergence of two major political parties. as the smaller parties merge together and eventually into two big parties emerge. So the first major political party in 1955 is the Socialist Party, as all of the kind of left-wing parties in Japan eventually unify together. And this was a source of great alarm to people in the Japanese center and on the right wing of the political spectrum. And in order to counter the emergence of the Socialist Party, all of the various moderate and center right and right wing parties essentially merged together to form a new political party, the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. And because the Liberal Democratic Party as a unified entity was so strong, it ends up being able to really dominate the Japanese political system for decades onwards. And in fact, from 1955 until 1993 onwards, every single election in Japan ends up being won by the LDP. So it's really fascinating, the system where in a lot of ways Japan is clearly a liberal democracy, right, in the sense that it has a democratic constitution, it has free and fair elections, it has freedom of speech and assembly, all the different things that we associate with democratic political systems. Japan has these features. But the one thing that Japan does not have is multi-party competition, right? In most established democracies, we tend to see this pattern of two or more major political parties that sort of shift back between, almost take turns. Power shifts back and forth between them during elections, right? Think of the United States, for example, where we have, the shifts between, the current president is Republican, but before that we had a Democratic president, Obama. Before him we had a Republican president, Bush, but before that was a Democratic president, Clinton. Right? You have this shift in party competition. We don't see this in Japan at all. Right? In Japan, we just see one single continuous period of rule by the LDP. So this is the first thing. What about Japan's international relations during this period? Well, Japan continued to move closer and closer to the United States, and essentially becomes a U.S. treaty ally during the Cold War. In 1958, the Japanese government announced that it was going to re-announce its relation. The Japanese government announced that it was going to renegotiate its relationship with the United States, in order to kind of put the Japanese government on a more equal footing with the U.S. But this ended up backfiring because this was seen by a lot of people in the Japanese population, especially sort of younger people and people on the left wing of the political spectrum, saw this as Japan taking sides in the Cold War. And this ended up becoming controversial because in the time that had followed since the end of the Second World War, Japan genuinely had embraced the ideology of pacifism. And so this is a fascinating thing where, as I mentioned before, the peace clause, Article 9, the pacifist section of the Japanese Constitution, was something that was imposed upon it from the outside. It wasn't originally something that Japan had chosen for itself. But clearly, in the time being, Japan had really taken the idea of pacifism and had genuinely come to embrace it. And of course, part of the reason for this was just because Japan had suffered so badly in the Second World War. The population had suffered due to the war, and it had lost cities due to the atomic bombs. And so this had led to this genuine groundswell of anti-war sentiment in Japan. And suddenly, the US found that having created this system of pacifism, this now meant that the idea of Japan officially becoming a treaty ally of the United States and essentially taking sides during the Cold War was massively controversial. And this was really the worst political crisis since the end of the Second World War. There were massive riots and protests on the streets of Japan. The US president had to cancel a planned visit there. In 1960, the Japanese Prime Minister of the time, Kishi, finally managed to get the treaty signed, but it was so damaging to his own political reputation that he ended up having to resign from government as a result. So what all of this basically shows us is the strength of the pacifist ideal that it had attained in Japan during this period. So this is looking at Japan's relationship with the United States. Let's quickly take a look at Japan's relationship with the other major superpower during the Cold War period, which was, of course, the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Japanese relationship with the USSR during this period was quite bad because of a Japanese territorial dispute dating back to the end of the war itself. So if you take a look at the map here, what we have is sort of Japan down here, and then above it we have Russian territory. And this little piece of land that juts out from the top of the map is the Kamchatka Peninsula in eastern Russia, and between this peninsula and Japan, there's this little string of islands that connects the two. And these islands were originally belonging to Japan, but were occupied by Soviet military forces in the final stages of the Second World War. And then this dispute ensued about whether or not the Soviets should give them back. The Soviet Union didn't want to. Japan demanded the return of the territory, and neither side could agree. The result of this dispute over the Kuril Islands is that today, there still is no, these two countries still haven't actually resolved this issue. And even today, Russia and Japan have never officially signed a treaty ending World War II. So sometimes you find like trivia quizzes and things like that say that, oh, did you know in some sense World War II technically never ended? Which is, obviously not strictly true, but it's kind of an interesting point that in this period, even though hostilities ended, the final status solution for the end of World War II between these countries was never agreed upon. And this is something that continues to be an ongoing issue in the relationship between Japan and Russia, even to this day. Okay, now let's switch from Japan's international relations during this period to look at the Japanese economy instead. And this is where things get really interesting because here's where we start to see the history of Japan really diverging from almost every other country in the world, just in terms of its level of economic development. So, as I said, at the end of the Second World War, Japan was completely devastated by the conflict itself, right? Like its cities were destroyed, hundreds of thousands of its people had been killed, its infrastructure was damaged, the economic challenges facing the country were enormous. And yet, by the mid-1950s already, what we start to see is Japan not only recovering from the catastrophe of the war, but the Japanese economy is now starting to grow and actually develop really quickly. The Japanese followed a policy of what's called import substitution. So this is a development strategy in which a country, instead of buying goods from overseas, tries to produce goods domestically for domestic consumption. So, like, for example, think of something like a car. What the Japanese would do is, instead of importing a car, if a Japanese person wants to buy a car, they wouldn't import it from the USA. Instead, a Japanese company would build the car, and sell them to Japanese consumers. And so, the Japanese companies started to develop. In the immediate aftermath of the war, we see growth in relatively simple and low technology sectors of the economy, like textiles. But over time, we start to see increasing growth in more industrial sectors like steel, in heavy industry, then in cars and ships and electronics and very advanced high-tech products. And pretty soon, Japan, moves from a policy of import substitution to export. So now, Japanese companies are not just making goods for the Japanese domestic market. Pretty soon, they start taking these goods and selling them abroad, and Japanese products start to become very popular in the rest of the world as well. The Japanese export industry was helped by the Americans, who essentially allowed Japan to adopt a policy of one-sided protectionism. So what this means is that Japanese companies could sell their goods in America to American consumers, but American companies had a very hard time selling American goods to Japanese consumers in Japan. So the Americans allowed this one-sided system, which almost gave Japanese companies a sort of an unfair advantage over their American counterparts. Why did America agree to this one-sided deal? Well, obviously it was because of the Cold War. America wanted Japan to rebuild. It wanted the Japanese economy to grow because it wanted Japan to be a strong and powerful ally in the Cold War. So it was willing to make these sorts of economic concessions in order to help Japan rebuild itself. And the result of all of this was a truly extraordinary level of economic growth. During the decade of the 1960s, Japan grew on average at 10.4% per year. When you have those sorts of growth rates compounding year after year, it leads to a massive explosion of wealth. And we've really never seen anything prior to that. Before that, there was never any case where any country was able to grow at such a speed. And we haven't really seen much, we haven't seen that since either, except for in one case, and this was China during the 1990s and the 2000s. Is really the only other case of a large country managing to grow at the same speed that Japan was. The result of this was that Japan's economy took off incredibly during the post-war period, and pretty soon Japan started to overtake wealthy Western European countries like first France, then Britain, then Germany, and by the end of the 1960s, Japan has now emerged as the second richest country in the world, only behind the United States. So how did they do it, right? What were the causes of this extremely high level of economic growth? Well, I'm going to look at two sets of factors, right? First of all, international factors, and then looking at economic policies within Japan itself. So in terms of the international factors, there were a number of advantages that the Japanese had. One of them was simply the low cost of oil. As you recall, I mentioned earlier that Japan is a net oil importer, right? It doesn't have any domestic sources of oil. So at the time, during the 1950s and 60s, international oil prices were cheap. So that gave Japan a favorable balance of payments. It also meant that Japan could build ships to produce oil tankers to transport international oil supplies around. It made it cheap and easy to export Japanese goods. It led to economic growth in other countries like the US, which then acted as customers that Japan could sell to. Another international factor that occurred during this period were the wars in Korea and then later on in Vietnam. Now, I mentioned in my lecture on the Vietnam War that the Vietnam War had really severely negative economic consequences for the United States. But even though the Vietnam War was very bad for the American economy, it ended up being quite good for the Japanese economy because Japan was the major logistical supply point for the U.S. military. So these conflicts forced America to invest huge military forces in Japan itself, and led the Americans to indirectly pump a a lot of money into the Japanese economy. It also reinforced the fact that Japan was a vital ally in the Cold War, right? Like the U.S. would not have been able to, the U.S. would not have been able to supply its armies in the field if it didn't have a logistical base nearby in the form of Japan. So it really proved to the Americans that Japan was a vital ally for them and led the Americans to continue to basically try to help and nurture and support the Japanese economy, through these policies of allowing Japan to export. There was another thing that also benefited Japan, which was the international economic system of the time. So since really since the end of the Second World War, the world economy was organized using the system known as the Bretton Woods system. And this was a system whereby all of the so it was designed to encourage international trade. Part of the idea of Bretton Woods is that all of the currencies of different countries would all be sitting at a fixed exchange rate. So if you look at the value of different currencies today, if I look at the rand dollar exchange rate today, it might not be the same as the rand dollar exchange rate tomorrow or what it was yesterday. Currency values fluctuate all the time. But back then, under the terms of this Bretton Woods system, all currencies were exchanged at fixed values. All currencies were basically fixed to the level of the US dollar. And then the US dollar itself was fixed to the value of gold, right? So everything would stay the same. And this was designed to promote and encourage international trade by keeping the global system of trade stable and predictable. And all of this worked really well for Japan, bearing in mind that Japan was a trading nation. Its money came from its exports. Then the other thing that really benefited Japan was its internal domestic economic management. So let's take a look at exactly what the Japanese government did internally. Now, Chalmers Johnston, who was an American political scientist who studied the Japanese, he wrote a very detailed study of the Japanese economy during this period. And his term that he used for describing the organization of the Japanese economy was that Japan was what he called a developmental state. The idea of a developmental state was that, during the Cold War, you had on the one hand the capitalist free market countries, where businesses were able to operate on their own without a lot of government interference. On the other hand, you had the communist or socialist countries of the Soviet Union and its allies, where you had complete state ownership and control of the economy. But what Johnson argued is that Japan was actually somewhere in between. The Japanese economy was a capitalist economy, but it was a capitalist economy that had a very significant role for the government. And the tool that Japan's government used to control the economy was the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which was in charge of making strategic investments in the economy, allocating Japan's supply of capital. So compare this to a typical kind of free market capitalist economy. In a free market system, investments are usually controlled by private investors. So, for instance, if you are trying to start your own business, you can go to a bank or go to some other investor and say, hey, listen, here's my business idea, please invest in me. And if you can convince people to invest in you, then you can start your own business. The difference was that in Japan, a lot of the investment capital was actually allocated by the government through the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which would try to make long-term investments in the future of the economy. So the government would say, look, we think based on our research that, let's say, for example, we think that color TVs are going to be a big thing a decade from now. We're going to invest in building up companies that can do this, and we'll take a loss for a little while, but then our Japanese companies will end up dominating this sector of the economy. And this is essentially what happened, right? The Japanese, the Japanese were often, not always, but they were often able to successfully identify and develop key sectors of the economy. And a lot of, essentially what they were doing was they were applying many of the same techniques, actually, that countries used during wartime. The same way that countries, during times of total war, a government will try to organize the whole of the state and the society towards defeating the enemy. Japan did the same thing during peacetime with the goal of developing the economy. And the system that is sometimes the sort of cute nickname that is sometimes used to describe the system is Japan Incorporated, right? The idea of Japan almost as being run like a single business, with the government taking on the role of the management function of this business. And you can see here, some of the results of the Japanese developmental state. We have, this is one of the successes of the Japanese developmental state was the Japanese car industry, right? The car industry, a very difficult, capital-intensive industry to create. It requires a lot of investment to get going, but the Japanese government was successfully able to encourage the growth of a number of domestic car companies, and their products ended up catching on. And today, of course, we know that Japanese car companies like Toyota and Honda are some of the most popular in the world. Japan also developed sectors like industry and chemicals and steel, heavy industry. All of these were notable Japanese economic successes. Interestingly, by the way, a lot of countries have subsequently tried to emulate and copy the Japanese model, but it's generally the Japanese model of the developmental state has generally not been successful when it's been applied most of the time outside of Japan itself. It's quite interesting to think of some possible reasons why that might be the case, but it seems as though the institutions of the Japanese government, it just has a very competent and professional civil service and bureaucracy. There seem to be a number of just kind of unique features of the Japanese system of government that really made it uniquely able to implement this type of system and succeed. So, this is something to think about, whether it's an interesting question to think about, the extent to which other countries, like perhaps even South Africa, could or should try to emulate this model. There've been a number of cases in South African history when the South African government has talked about the idea of following a developmental state in South Africa. And it's interesting to think, I won't try to answer that question, but I would say just give it some thought yourself, the extent to which such a model, can and should be emulated by other countries. In any case, let's now move on to the period of the 1970s. And we'll see that the first problems now start to emerge with this very successful Japanese model. And the first signs of trouble start to come from overseas, specifically in terms of Japan's relationship with the United States. From the 1970s onwards, the United States, which had previously been very successful after the Second World War, started to experience more and more economic problems. There were really two problems that the US was facing. Part of the problem was just a big problem that the US faced was the Vietnam War, right? The American government had invested an enormous amount of money funding the catastrophic Vietnam War, and had basically got nothing in return for its investment. In response to the spending, the United States was having to increasingly borrow money and engage in deficit spending, and was also suffering the pressures of inflation. In 1971, the American government under Richard Nixon responded to these challenges through two events that became known as the Nixon shocks, that were just absolutely really like shocking to Japan. The first of these was Nixon's visit to communist China, which he didn't bother to tell the Japanese about in advance, and this created a lot of fear and panic in Japan that, you know, the US sort of wouldn't need Japan as much as a regional ally anymore. But the second Nixon shock was far worse. The Americans announced that they were going to be ending the policy of dollar convertibility to gold, and essentially the Americans were getting rid of the Bretton Woods system. And the Americans did this without telling anybody in advance, and they didn't bother to inform the Japanese. Now, this was extremely worrying for the Japanese, because as I mentioned before, you know, the Bretton Woods system had really been good for Japan. Japan had grown under this system. Now, in the end, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system actually wasn't that bad, right? We know that today we have a system of, the Bretton Woods system has been exchanged with a system of free-floating currencies. So we no longer have a system where all values of currencies are fixed. Instead, the value of currencies changes and adjusts over time, and we just kind of deal with it. The world economy hasn't collapsed or anything. But the problem at the time, I mean, even if the consequences were not as bad as what was originally thought, what was really traumatic from the perspective of the Japanese is that the Americans didn't bother to inform them or tell them about any of this beforehand. They just kind of went ahead and did it. And what was really troubling was the psychological sense that for 20 years, right, since World War II ended, the Japanese had really had the sense of America as their kind of protector nation. You know, Americans did everything they could to nurture and help the Japanese economy to grow, to redevelop the Japanese economy after the Second World War. So the Japanese had a really, really good relationship with the United States. And what we had here in 1971 was the United States behaving selfishly, not, it just made it clear to the Japanese that Americans would actually follow their own interests, and that, you know, the Japanese couldn't just rely on the US to always help out the Japanese. And this trend of the relationship between Japan and the US becoming more strained continued further into the 1980s. Part of the problem here is that the US economy had continued to stall, where I mean the US economy had continued to grow slowly, at least, whereas the Japanese economy continued to experience roaring growth. And at some point, the Americans had to ask themselves, why, you know, given that Japan is doing so well, why are the Americans continuing to allow this relationship to be so one-sided? I mean, look at all of the nice things that America is doing for Japan here, right? America has a huge military, basically donates a huge amount of its military strength to keep its forces permanently stationed in Japan. So Japan gains a huge economic benefit from the fact that they almost get to have it both ways, right? They get the military security of protection from the US Army, but they don't have to spend their own money on their own military. They essentially get military security for free. And then at the same time, they get to export their goods freely and easily to America, whereas American companies are largely locked out of the Japanese market. This is how many Americans saw the issue, at least. And, you know, during the 80s, there was a lot of American domestic rhetoric published by, you know, many American politicians became more critical of Japan. This was a trend known as Japan bashing, right? Like Americans essentially criticizing Japan and saying that the relationship needs to be more two-sided. There was even one particular article was published very heavily criticizing the Japanese economic policies by a young real estate developer named Donald Trump, who subsequently, of course, became the U.S. president, and continued to has continued to express many of these types of views in his presidency. Some conspiracy theorists in the US even felt that this was part of a sort of a Japanese campaign of economic warfare against the United States. Some Americans said that this was essentially a case where Japanese had tried to conquer the US military. The Japanese had tried to conquer the US using military power in World War II and had failed, but now they were instead going to swallow up and just buy the US using their economic power instead. And in the end, this didn't happen because, as we shall see, the Japanese economy is now going to go into decline. But at the time, there was a lot of fear and paranoia about Japan in American politics. So Japan's response to this was to try to move away somewhat from the US and pursue what was called a policy of omnidirectional diplomacy. This was basically a policy where Japan would not so much emphasize just its relationship with the US, and it would look for partnerships with other countries as well. Japan began trying to improve its relationship with Korea, with South Korea, with the Soviet Union, even with communist China, and in 1978, Japan signed a peace treaty with China. Nonetheless, despite all these problems, during the 1980s, Japan's economy was still doing really well. You can see here, this is a nice photograph of something that was really almost like this fantastic symbol of Japanese strength and wealth and economic advancement and technological sophistication during the 1980s, and this was the Shinkansen, the bullet train, basically the best and most the most sophisticated system of passenger rail anywhere in the world. These trains that crisscross across the Japanese islands, and is just unparalleled in terms of its speed and reliability and punctuality. And here you can see the enormous city of Tokyo, right? Again, giving you a sense of the level of development that Japan ultimately achieved. Tokyo, this truly extraordinary city, the largest city in the world, if you measure it according to the size of its greater metro area, something like 30 million people living here. It's absolutely mind-boggling to think of. But basically what we have here is the equivalent of half the population of South Africa living in this one sprawling, massive city. And this ended up pushing up, this level of economic development ended up pushing up property prices, which ends up becoming actually a significant problem. During the late 1980s, there were signs that the Japanese economy was starting to slow down. But instead of, there were signs that the Japanese economy was starting to slow down, but rather than let that happen, the Japanese central bank tried to stimulate economic growth going and tried to keep the economy expanding faster by cutting interest rates, making it easier for people to borrow money, and basically stimulating more and more investment into the economy. If you look at these two graphs here, you can sort of see what happens, right? During the late 1980s, money flows into the Japanese economy. The Japanese price of property and real estate soars. During the late 1980s, the Japanese stock market shoots up. There seems to be this explosion of wealth. And then, unfortunately, in 1991, the Japanese economy crashes, and the Japanese economy goes into this prolonged period of stagnation. And this period, so in around about 1990, this asset bubble bursts. The Japanese period of economic growth really comes to an end, and this is often referred to as the last decade, but that's actually a bit of a misnomer because the last decade's been going on now for almost 3 decades at this point. Japan has still never been able to return itself to the levels of rapid economic growth that it experienced during the 60s and 70s and 80s. So what has happened since then? Well, since the 1990s, Japan has experienced significant changes, both in its economy, its political system, and in its international relations. If we look in terms of its international relations, Japan has continued to experience issues in its relationship with the rest of the world. A key turning point was the Gulf War in 1991. So in 1991, the state of Iraq under Saddam Hussein attacked its neighboring state, Kuwait, and the USA responded by organizing a multinational coalition, went around and formed this huge military alliance of basically all of the most powerful countries in the world, worked together to send in this massive military coalition into Iraq, and basically forcibly eject the Iraqi military from Kuwait, and restore Kuwaiti sovereignty. This was supposed to be this model for how security was now going to work in the aftermath of the Cold War, but Japan did not participate, right? Japan, I mean, the Japanese sort of justification was, well, they're not allowed to participate in international military operations because of the peace clause of their constitution. And America was fed up. They felt that Japan was not pulling its weight in the international system. So this led to a period of strain again between Japan and its main ally, the United States. Japan also experienced increasing political dysfunction at home from the 1990s onwards. During the mid-1990s, Japan went through a period of political chaos and dysfunction, in which it went through 7 prime ministers during a 6-year period. In 1993, the LDP even lost power and was kicked out of government for the first time in its history. You can see what a massive development this would have been in Japanese politics, right? Remember, the LDP, this absolutely dominant party, it's won every single election. There's now sufficient chaos in the Japanese political and economic system that the LDP is actually losing power. Although the LDP is only out of power for 1 year and then it comes back in again. The opposition wasn't able to form a government either, but it shows the sort of problems that Japan was experiencing, and the level of economic stagnation continues. It's an open question about what Japan needs to do to try to fix, to try to return its economy to growth. During the 1980s. A number of other developed countries, such as the UK and the USA, went through what was called a period of neoliberalism, right? A period in which they moved more towards a kind of a free market capitalist economic system. At least some economists think that maybe what Japan actually needs is something similar, right? That some economists argue that Japan's policy of having a developmental state, it worked well for developing the economy, but that now that Japan is wealthy, it should move more towards a free market type of economic system. Well, maybe that would work for Japan, maybe it wouldn't, but regardless, no Japanese government has ever been able to implement such policies because they would be too unpopular with the population. So the question of what to do sort of remains uncertain. Okay, so we've more or less now almost caught up to the present day. Before I end this lecture, though, I want to just quickly look at one last remaining interesting topic, which is the question of Japan's cultural and social values, and the role that those have played in its economic development. Japan is a fascinating country in terms of its culture and society because of the way that it blends different aspects, right? Obviously, Japan has, Japanese society today, still in many ways reflects, traditional Japanese culture, but also Japan has also embraced many aspects of Western culture. So you have this fascinating sort of cultural blending. It's kind of one of the cliches of Japanese society, although it is true, is that Japanese society is one that emphasizes hard work and working very long hours, and also a culture of savings and investment. And these are things that have indeed helped to boost, these are things that help to encourage Japanese economic development. On the other hand, the fact that Japan's social values are in some ways also quite conservative, has also held back some aspects of the Japanese economy. One of the interesting problems that Japan faces in terms of the issue of gender attitudes, right, and the issue of women's place in women and their role in the economy and in society, is still a question that Japan is grappling with even today. So Japan never really had a second wave feminist movement, like most Western countries did, in which women came into the workforce and pursued careers. And even today in Japanese politics, the current Japanese government of Shinzo Abe, even though it's quite a conservative government in some ways, has tried to encourage more women's participation in the economy, just as a way of stimulating economic growth, but has struggled with this just because cultural norms and values are, they're difficult to change. But when you have the situation where a significant part of the population is socially discouraged from participating in the economy, as women often are, it sets a bit of a cap on Japan's economic potential. So nonetheless, though, although Japan is in certain respects a somewhat conservative society, it's also in a lot of ways a very modern and extremely futuristic society in other ways. And many of Japan's cultural exports have become extremely popular with the rest of the world. And some of the obvious things here are things like, Japanese animation, Japanese consumer goods, Japanese, just things like Japanese film, cuisine, and so on. There's many aspects of Japanese culture that it's been able to export and to the rest of the world. It's so in the same, if we think of countries that kind of export their culture overseas, like think of the role of Hollywood or something in exporting American culture. Japan sort of does the same thing, maybe not to the same extent, but it has enjoyed a lot of success exporting its culture to foreign nations. I guess ultimately the most interesting thing about Japanese society today is that it does sort of convey the sense that it does show that it is possible to be an economically successful country without completely giving up your own traditional cultural values. Japan has managed to do that. So at the end of the day, what we have is this interesting blend between Japanese culture and Western ideas and American specific values. We have this interesting mix between like conservative values and modern values. It creates a sort of a hybrid and blended form of society. So if we bring our focus all the way up to today and say, well, what is Japan's current role in the world right now? Well, despite successive attempts by a variety, a series of Japanese governments, no Japanese prime minister has been able to put in place economic reforms that have been able to return Japan to the high growth period of the era of high speed growth. It hasn't happened. Japan's economy has largely continued to stagnate. That said, although Japan's economy has largely stagnated, it's done so at a high level. In other words, although there hasn't been a lot of growth in the past couple of decades, Japanese citizens, on average, are still some of the wealthiest. They're still some of the wealthiest of any population in the world. Japan is still, in an absolute sense, it has a high GDP per capita and a very high standard of living compared to the majority of other countries. In terms of its society, Japan has one of Japan's problems is it has a low birth rate, which has resulted in a shifting demographic profile. Because the Japanese birth rate is low, over time we have the situation where the percentage of the population that is young starts to become smaller and smaller, and the percentage of the population that becomes the percentage of the population that is elderly becomes larger and larger. So its demographic profile is that of an aging population. So between the fact that it has an aging population, it has a extensive government that provides a lot of services and has an extensive welfare state, and also the economy, the rate of economic growth has been low for several decades. All of these things combine to ensure that the Japanese government spends a lot of money, more than it takes in the form of taxation. And this means that over time, Japan has built up a significant amount of government debt. Japan's rate of government debt to GDP is 200%. Now, to put this in comparison, when South Africa's debt to GDP ratio started to go over about 60% a couple of years ago, many people started to say, oh, this is a potential financial crisis in South Africa, and South African government debt might be downgraded to junk bond status. And this was with us having over 60% in South Africa. Well, Japan has a government debt ratio of over 200%, which shows you that the level of indebtedness of the Japanese government is potentially a serious problem. So these are some of the economic challenges that it's going to have to face. The other challenge it's going to have to face is just with its aging population. Where is it going to get the workforce from? Is it going to be able to change its society to encourage a higher birth rate? The other possibility is that Japan might want to bring in immigrants from overseas. This is how many other countries, if other countries might deal with their population problems, you can always make immigration easier to allow your population to expand that way. But there are strong social and cultural norms against immigration in Japanese society. Might Japan respond to these problems through automation or technological development or something like that? We shall have to see. The other thing, if we look at Japan's current place in the world, is in terms of its foreign relations. Japan continues in some ways to be in a slightly dangerous neighborhood of the world. It has neighbors like North Korea, which has been aggressive and threatening. It has ongoing territorial disputes, Japan has ongoing territorial disputes with Russia and also with the People's Republic of China. Although it still has its alliance with the United States, and it still actually has a fairly powerful military, especially its powerful navy. So if we combine all these things together, we see that Japan does continue to face a number of important issues, and the question is really how the political system is going to be able to cope with and deal with these challenges. These are some of the issues that Japan faces going forward. So for this week's movie of the week, I want to recommend a piece of Japanese cinema, and this is the animated film The Wind Rises by Hayao Miyazaki, a really famous Japanese director who's acclaimed for making, he's often considered to be one of the great directors of animated film in cinematic history. So this particular movie deals with a period of Japanese history, not really the period we've been looking at in this lecture, but it looks at the period of Japanese history in the early part of the 20th century, in the build-up to World War II. It's like a really interesting piece of cinema. I would suggest taking a look if you have some free time. But then just a reminder to complete the Moodle quiz before Sunday evening. Also do participate in the online forum discussion that is ongoing for the rest of the week. I hope I shall see you for the guest lecture on Friday. And then I shall see you the week after next for the lecture. But otherwise, have a great public holiday, and don't forget to vote in next week's election.